Hello, my name is Laura, and I am totally out of my comfort zone. I'm not the kind of person to do videos, but just a couple of things. Obviously, with a lot of people across the United States currently being at home and having to educate their home, I am a homeschooler. I educate my children at home and always have, so my life hasn't really changed in that regard much since these stay-at-home orders and quarantines have been coming into effect. And I really wasn't planning to offer anything online. There's so much, and I know we're all, at home and we can sit around and watch videos all day unless we have real work that we're still trying to do. But even so, it's just, I didn't want to flood the conversation because there's just so much out there. But I've been listening to a lot of parents and paying attention and seeing articles about families that are beginning to really struggle with this, especially those who have had their children in the public school system and have been used to having a routine where they have full-time jobs and maybe they're still having to do those jobs at home, and so having the extra burden of educating their children is just a lot. And so I've decided to do this, even though this is awkward for me, but I do want to offer some encouragement to parents that are in a new era right now with their kids. Some of them probably won't be returning. A lot of our children probably won't be returning to school until the fall, and this is very difficult. And so just so you give a little bit of background on why I want to be an encouragement to families right now. I was homeschooled all the way through, from kindergarten through high school. My mother and parents homeschooled me before anybody did. We were a really rare bunch in those days back in the 80s, late 70s and 80s and 90s. And my mom just had a high school diploma. She didn't have a college education. She was very nervous about it. We weren't homeschooled in the sense that people think of today because we were hardly ever home. Part of the reason I had to be homeschooled was because we traveled all over the United States. And so my mom was very humble about how she administered this. She was very scared to do it, but she did an incredible job. And the number one thing that she instilled in me was a love of learning. And obviously that's the goal, isn't it? And I know that's the goal for teachers in the public school system. They want their students to love learning and to be lifelong learners. And so that was my upbringing. I did go to a traditional university classroom situation right out of high school, did very well, and I really didn't have the adjustment issues that some people said I would have. Socially, I was fine. I did fine academically, not as well as I wanted to at the time, but I still did good. Even received some scholarships, so it wasn't too horrible. And then I married my best friend that I met in college. He is an ordained minister, and I am an ordained minister now. I wasn't when we got married. I didn't finish college after we got married. That just wasn't in the budget. So I finished my undergraduate degree in ministry later, quite a few years later, after we had 4 children. And I did that primarily online, actually all online, the last part of my undergraduate. So I was an online at-home student, and at the time I was also working as a children's pastor, as a pastor of spiritual formation. So I was balancing, at the time I was also homeschooling our 4 children. So I was a home educator, I was a student myself, working online. My children, we did not do an online curriculum. We did have a curriculum, but so I was balancing homeschooling and being schooled myself through online classes, and also working in ministry with my husband, having a job. So that was a heavy burden, and so I can kind of relate, maybe not exactly, obviously everybody has their own situation, but I can sort of relate to what some parents are probably going through right now with balancing 3 or 4 or 5 roles, and that's tough. I went on and received my master's degree, which was primarily online as well. So I had a total of about over 5 years of online education. I'd like to talk maybe at this point just to some parents of young children, and you're having to educate them at home right now, and it's especially if it's a temporary situation. The best way I can explain the difference maybe between where you have been, where your children have been in the public school, to where you are now is the public school system is kind of like a large ship. And so classroom education is designed a certain way because it's like you're moving this big ship. Everybody's together. Well, big ships have to go slow. You can't turn them on a dime. If they make a course correction, they've got to take into account the size. And when you take your child from that big ship type scenario, and now you're educating them at home, even if you're not the teacher, but you're just having to administer that, it's like you have moved into a small little motorboat. And what I mean by that is it can be you can feel a lot of pressure because your children are in school for 8 hours a day in the public schools to keep that up at home and feel like you have to start your child on school at 8 o'clock in the morning and they have to be there till 3:30 or 4 o'clock at night or in the afternoon. And that's not really the case. That's how a big ship has to move. It's important. There's a reason that there's so many hours in the public school. But when your child, it's just you and you've got this small unit and you're in this small little boat, there's a lot more flexibility. And at this time, especially for young children who are missing their friends and are really struggling, or you as a parent, you can be overwhelmed. I mean, good night, to try to keep your child entertained for hours on end and keep them educated. I mean, that's just insane. You don't need to do that. You really don't. When you're educating at home, you can do it in a lot less time as far as book learning is concerned. And obviously, if your school has given your child assignments and they're trying to educate them remotely, take advantage of that. The fact that if they've given them a certain amount of work, that needs to be the goal. They're not getting paid by the hour. They're getting an assignment, and they need to just focus on the assignment. And when the assignment's done, you don't need to add to that. You don't need to weigh your kid down. This is and you don't need to weigh yourself down, to be honest. Just focus on the fact that, this is school, this needs to be done. But in a lot of ways, you think of education as preparation maybe for the workforce. I think that's been the intent in past of why we have school, is to prepare for when we are adults and we're in the workplace. And, you can't, I noticed at this time people can be very extreme. They can feel like, there's just so much in the air, we're just going to forget about school. It's not important. We need to just be there for each other and make sure we're not traumatized. And I get that. I really do. I understand the point. There's a certain amount of logic to that. But you can go so far to the extreme that you may not realize you might be teaching your child that when a crisis happens, we stop and we don't function. And I don't know, is that something we all want to teach our children? I think if we're honest with each other, we want to teach our children someday they're going to be adults, they're going to be running this country, and if a crisis, something like this happens, we want to know that they can handle it. They're strong enough that they can push forward and keep America going, keep America running. And so these are things you can instill even in your young child off the bat. Plus, and this may not be the case for every child, but I know I have one child in particular that during this time, even though we homeschool, and maybe it's because of our situation, she has been really finding, I think, some stability and familiarity with and I don't mean school like the experience, I mean the actual work, the math equations, the homework assignments and things like that. That's becoming her familiar. And so it's not a bad thing. Sometimes if there's too much time on your young child's hands, their brains can really go and they can become anxious. And honestly, their schoolwork can be a way to be a bit of an anchor for them. Something a little familiar, something that's not just constantly talking about the pandemic, but is a little bit of normalcy in a very unnatural and unnormal situation, a not normal situation. For older students, and I would like to, I'd address them directly because I've been one and I've taught them, middle school and high school students. This is going to be really challenging if you've come from a public school setting, because you've probably been used to being on that big ship, and when the ship moves, everybody moves together, and you probably have people that are reminding you to do your assignments and standing over you or giving you a chance you can do it at school, if you have extra time, or there's tutors available that can help you one-on-one, and now all of a sudden you've been pulled out of that and you are in your own little private boat, and what are you going to do now? There's more independence with this, but there's also more responsibility as well. And it can be very overwhelming. And one thing I want to encourage you and parents of older students too is don't be afraid to ask for help. Okay, you're not a bad mom, you're not a bad dad, you're not a bad parent, you're not a bad student, you're not stupid. If you call your teachers and you ask them for help, that's what they're there for, and many of them would love to be able to help you. If that's not an option for you, or if you can't find help in that way, reach out to a friend or reach out to a family member who can help you, maybe tutor through FaceTime or whatever, but just it's not a judgment on your intelligence or your parenting if you ask people for help. We all have to. I have to constantly be asking for help. I can teach English and history and no problem. When it comes to math and science, I'm usually calling my husband saying, "Hey, you got to do this." There's no shame in that, so do that. For other high school students, and I would say high school and college, my son is home from college right now. He's in his second year of college, and he is finishing up. Quarantined in his room because he traveled through some areas into our area which does not have any cases of COVID-19 right now, and because of that he has to quarantine because he traveled through some areas that were had big outbreaks. And so while he's in quarantine, he's really catching up on his classwork. He's doing an incredible job. I'm not having to remind him of anything, which is great, and I think a lot of that is because he was homeschooled through 8th grade, went to public school through high school, but he established very early on sort of a self-motivation that has served him very well, and he has done an exceptional job academically and socially at the college level, and he did at the high school level as well. He was got incredibly good grades, and again, it's not because, I'll tell you, even as his mom, he's not exceptionally smart. A lot of getting good grades and getting through this time it comes down to character, comes down to diligence. And, especially if you're in high school or in college, this is what you're preparing for. And when you get into the workplace, your character is going to take you farther than your intelligence. I'll just be honest. There are a lot of employers out there that, you can be smarter as a whip, but if you are prideful or you're arrogant or you're snotty or whatever, forget it. If you want to compete in this world and do well academically, and later on in the career of your choice, your character is going to take you very far. What better opportunity than right now to let this build your character, to not implode? And it will serve you well. And, in the future, there are going to be times, especially if you're a senior, oh my goodness, our hearts go out to you. You've lost a lot this year, and that's not cool. That sucks. But if you can look at it as, in the future, your employer or place that you want to have employment, when they see that you graduated in 2020 and they know full well what this pandemic has done to you and to your class, if you have pushed through this and you have graduated well and you have applied yourself and you've done the work, that's going to go really far. It's going to help you. It's going to be an advantage. So what you've been robbed of doesn't have to be a complete robbery. You can turn it around, but it's up to you. It is really up to you. Overall, and I'll just finish with this, my encouragement is balance. I mentioned before that some parents are tempted to, because of the chaos and because of the uncertainty right now, to not want to push their kids in any way academically. And I think personally that in some cases that might need to happen, and I definitely, your child better than anyone. You know what they're capable of, and you know when they've been pushed too much. And if you feel like you need to back off, please, I encourage you, just, be there for your kid. You know what they need. But don't be afraid, I guess, to push your child in the education, especially if it's required. And we're changing things up, and the teachers are saying, hey, they need to do this. You need to enforce that. You need to back up your school system and do that and push your kid. Because we have to get through this together, and we can't just go into freeze mode and not function. This is a country that is strong, and we're strong together because we don't let things like this stop us from doing what we need to do. On the other hand, the other extreme is, and I guess I sort of indirectly addressed this. You can get so under pressure to try to do it the way that your child has had it done, meaning the 8-hour school day and all this extra work and everything. try to release yourself from that kind of pressure. You don't need to do that. This is not a big ship. This is a small boat. You can take a break. If your kid is getting frustrated and is bogged down with school, you can walk outside, take a family walk, or go in your backyard and decide, hey, we're going to eat supper at the fire pit, and we're going to just take a breather, or we're going to take a coffee break. Or this is a good opportunity for you to teach your kid how to handle stress at work in the future. And if you don't know how yourself, then hey, learn with your child. That's the other advantage of at-home education, is you and your child are in this together. You're doing this together, and maybe there's something you can teach each other. The other night, my daughter and I were eating supper in the backyard, and she suddenly interrupted the conversation, and she says, "Mom, there's a 7-legged spider." I was like, "Oh, really?" And we looked at it, and yeah, it was a spider that was missing a leg. And she started to talk very academically. I was quite impressed. Talked about insects and arachnids, and started to go into stuff that she had been learning in science. And I had a moment where I realized this is the goal. This is the goal, to connect real life with a love of learning, an inquisitive mind. And that's what I'm here for. And the book work is a part of that, but it's not the whole. And so that's the advantage you have at teaching your kid at home. This does not have to be something where your life is on pause and your kid's education and learning is on pause. No, this can just be a new way of learning and of instilling in yourself as well as your child that there's a lot we can all learn. We've all been humbled through this, and we can move forward, and we can learn, and we can grow together. So I hope that's an encouragement to you. If this is a help, and there's an indication there is, I might do another one of these later and maybe get into some more details and some tips on how you can educate at home. But I hope that's an encouragement to you today. Thanks for listening.